Thank you so much, James. So great to be here. I'm so happy to see so many faces here today. And yeah, I'm really glad that you guys can make it out here, even despite midterms and papers and everything that's going on. And so just to give a quick little recap of what we covered last week, Manny gave a wonderful word introducing us to not only Genesis, but also the Bible. Manny shared with us last week that actually the subject of the Bible is Jesus Christ himself. He says this in John 5, where he says to the Pharisees that they search the scriptures, they may have thinking that in them they have life, but they don't come to him that they might have life, because the scriptures even testify concerning him. Wow. And to give an introductory word to the book of Genesis, Manny shared with us that in the book of Genesis, the main subject is also Christ. And so he has this wonderful word that in Genesis 1, it records not only the beginning of the material universe, but that Genesis 1 even describes the beginning of our faith, our life with God, with Jesus Christ, right? God didn't just speak light into a universe that was waste and void, but in the midst of our situation of waste, darkness, and void, Jesus Christ came in as the light. And this light brings with it life wherever it goes. And so we see that the prerequisite for us to grow in our Christian life is to let Christ in as the light into all of our different situations. And Manny speaking on this matter was so practical, because the way to let him in as the light is just as simple as praying small prayers. Prayers that can be small as just calling the Lord's name, confessing that he is Lord. Lord Jesus, come into my situation. Come into my exam, my paper, whatever it is that I'm struggling with. And he comes in as the light. And so picking up from where our brother Manny left off, we come to verse 12 of Genesis 1. And in this section, we see that God, he's creating all sorts of life. And so in verse 12, we see that the earth brought forth grass, herbs, and trees according to their kind. Now, pay attention to this highlighted phrase here, because it shows up again and again. In verse 21, God created the great sea creatures and every winged bird according to its kind. And verse 24 again, let the earth bring forth living animals according to their kind. Okay, so we see that God, he produced all the life on earth, right? The grass according to the grass kind, the birds according to the bird kind, the fish according to the fish kind, the land animals according to their different kinds. So verse 26 finally brings us to the peak of all creation, where God creates us, creates human beings, creates man. And we would think that in that verse, if you had to take a guess what that verse says, wouldn't we expect it to say that God created man according to mankind? That sounds like it would make sense, right? That's what I thought too, but let's actually come to the verse and see what it says. And God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Wow. Just let that sink in for a second. Because we saw how God created all of these different kinds of life, all the other kinds of life in the universe. And we see in this one little verse that we are created differently from all other life that exists, because we alone are created in God's image. So as human beings, we're not created according to mankind, but you could even say that we are created according to God's kind, actually. So this is something wonderful and marvelous. And so we come to the first half of our topic for today. Today we'll be covering this matter of image, and later on in this same verse, dominion. And so we see this word image here appear, that we are created in God's image. What does this mean? Does this mean that our physical appearance somehow matches the physical appearance of God? Well, the Bible makes clear that God is invisible, right? So that can't be it. But actually, in level, him according to our inward content, our inward attributes, right? There are many ways in which we're different from all the other animals. We're able to love, right? And our human love is a picture of God's love, right? We are able to have empathy, and that's a picture of God's empathy, right? We're able to have compassion, that's a picture of God's compassion. But even deeper than this, there's an even deeper significance to what it means that we are made in the image of God. And this significance is that we are made to be filled with God. Now you might be wondering, how do we arrive at that, right? Well, there's another set of verses, Romans 9, verses 23 and 24, which tells us that we are vessels, right? It says, in order that he might make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, even us, right? We are vessels. Human beings are vessels. And what is a vessel? A vessel is a container, right? You know, just as this water bottle is a container for water, so we as human beings are also a container for something. And what is that something? That something is Christ, is God himself. Colossians 1:27 says, Christ in you, the hope of glory. And the fact that we are made, that we are vessels, combined with the fact that we are made in God's image, suggests this to us so strongly. To give you an illustration, we are made in the image of God as vessels in the same sense that a glove is a vessel, right? A container made in the image of a hand, right? And so while it's possible for me to fit all kinds of things into this glove, like, I don't know, like this wrench, or like, I guess if I tried harder, like my cell phone or something, it's obvious though the true purpose of this glove, what this glove is meant for, is to be filled with the hand. And that when this glove is filled with the hand, it is able to express the hand in everything that the hand does. And so likewise, we as human beings are made in God and to express God. This is the purpose of our existence. And so you're not created just to contain food in your stomach. You're not created just to contain knowledge in your mind. Students, no matter what your professors try to tell you, you're not just created to contain biology, to contain engineering analysis, to contain journalism or political philosophy, but we are created to contain God, to contain Christ. Isn't that wonderful? Wow, no wonder none of those other things can satisfy us, because we're created to contain God. And so that's actually something that you can share, you know, with your friends, you know, when they feel like they're struggling with classes. You know, it's such a nourishing word, an encouraging word that, hey, you know, yes, we're struggling with this right now, but this isn't the ultimate purpose of our lives, though. We can contain God. Now, moving on from there, we come to our first point for today's message. We are created in God's image to be filled with God. Now let's have a look at the second half of Genesis 1:26. And God said, let us make man in our image, and also let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of heaven, and over the cattle, and over all the earth. And so we see that God created us for a twofold purpose: to have his image, to contain him and express him. And then this expression is meant for us to exercise his dominion, his ruling, right? His authority over all these different kinds of life, right? But actually, this isn't the end of the verse, though. There's another thing that God specifically had in mind, another kind of creature that he had in mind that we would have dominion over. And that is over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Wow. Very specific, right? What could this creeping thing be referring to? Well, 2 chapters later in Genesis 3, a creeping thing appears, right? The serpent, the creep, Satan, right? You know, the creep of all creeps, right? And so we bear God's image and are created to be filled with him in order to exercise his dominion over Satan, right? And that means we rule not only over, you know, some guy who appears to us as in a red jumpsuit with a pitchfork, but Satan manifests himself as all sorts of negative things in the universe today, right? As emptiness, right? As sadness, depression, anxiety, worthlessness, right? All of these different things, right? And so we are meant to be filled with God in order to exercise his dominion over all of those things. So in your situations as well, you know, I remember as a college student, I surely experienced many of those negative things in my situation. But God, he wants to fill us and to be our content in order that we can conquer over those things. And so an important point, though, is that there's a relationship between this matter of dominion and image, right? In fact, we can have dominion over all these negative things only when we are filled with God. John 15, Jesus clearly tells us this. In verse 5, he says, "He who abides in me and I in him," right? Christ in you, right? Bears much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. And so we have to be filled with in order to conquer all the negative things in our situation, right? And so the next time when, you know, you're struggling, the next time when I'm struggling to overcome a certain difficulty, to persevere through a certain situation, you know, while it is important that we ask ourselves, you know, okay, what can I do to resolve this problem? Another important question that we have to ask ourselves is, Lord, have I come to you to be filled with you today so that I can face all of these negative things? And the way that we can be filled with God, building off of what Manny shared with us in his word last week, is that we can ask God to fill us, right? We can ask him, we can pray to him such simple prayers as, Lord Jesus, you're the Lord of the universe. Thank you so much for creating me in your image. Lord, what I need most is just to be filled with you right now so that I can conquer your enemy in this situation. And so the second point of today's message, only when we are filled with God can we have dominion over the creep, Satan. And lastly, sorry, that's a typo up there. This is Genesis 1:26. And lastly, there's another important point about having dominion. Notice that God doesn't say, let him, her have dominion over the fish of the sea, right? It's not singular there. But God says, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of heaven. And most importantly, over every creeping thing, right? The creep. Right? And so we see that this matter of exercising God's dominion, it's not just an individual matter, right? But that this is a matter in which we need the other members of the body of Christ. We need to be around others who are also filled with God in order to exercise his dominion over all of our negative situations, right? We need to speak encouragement to one another, right? We need to have some companions, right, with whom we can pursue Christ and conquer the enemy. Ecclesiastes 4 is a clear confirmation of this. Verse 9, 2 are better than 1, right? For if they fall, the one will lift up his companion. And while a man may prevail against the one, the 2 will withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken, right? So who is your companion, right, with whom you can form a 2 that will withstand? Who are the 2 with whom you can form a threefold cord that is not quickly broken? Right? This is so important for our going on in our Christian life. And so our final point, we exercise dominion not alone, but with others who are filled with God. And so these are our 3 points that we covered today to summarize today's message. And just to tie it all together, I just want to share a little experience that I had from when I was in college. So in my junior year of college, I took linear algebra, everyone's favorite subject, I know. But this class was not just linear algebra, it was called abstract linear algebra. So when a class, straight up tells you that it's going to be abstract, I probably should have taken it as like a warning sign of some sort. But anyway, there was one weekend where my professor for that class gave us a take-home exam. And he said, oh, like it'll take you about 3 or 4 hours to finish it. And so I thought, oh, great. Well, 3 or 4 hours, there's a church retreat going on this weekend. So I'll go to the church retreat and then I'll come back Sunday night and then I'll wrap it up in 3 or 4 hours before it's due Monday morning. Great plan, right? Well, I got back. I went to the library and I started, I sat down at 7 p.m. and I got started working. And then 7 became 8 and then 8 became 9. 9 skipped a couple steps and became 11. And then the library closed. And then 11 became 1 in the morning. And I sat there looking at my paper and I had a quarter of the questions answered. So if I had gotten everything right so far with all my work, I would get 25% on the test. And so in that moment, the creep had me right where he wanted me. I was about to have a full-on panic attack. And I just thought, there's no way I'm going to survive this. And he's just started injecting all sorts of things into my mind. It's like, how could you be so dumb? How could you be so worthless, right? All the other kids, I'm sure they're finished already. They got this, they're going to ace it. But what about you, right? It's like, but thankfully though, brother in the Lord came over, another student who was pulling a late night in the library. And he was on his way out, but he saw my situation and he gave me coffee and some food. And that was just such an encouragement to me. But above all, it reminded me to pray to the Lord, to turn to the Lord and to call on his name. It reminded me that my real need is not to conquer this exam, that my value is not in my grades or in my performance as a student, but that my value is in the fact, the irrefutable, indisputable fact, that I am created to contain and be filled with God and to express him, right? All other things in this life are important, yes, but they're subsidiary to that. The most important thing, we already have it, right? I already have it. And so I just prayed to the Lord, Lord, fill me. Lord, remind me what really matters, right? That I have you. And that because I have you, I can get through this. It's no problem. Remind me, Lord. And so eventually I did have to pull an all-nighter for that exam, but by the time the sun came up, I had something down for every question. But most importantly, I was able to continue on because by the Lord coming in and filling me, he just took away all of that anxiety that was on my shoulders, that crippling anxiety. And peace, and I could overcome that situation by his mercy. And by his mercy, I passed that class too. So whew, C's get degrees, you know. and so I hope that this word can just be such an encouragement to all of you, whether it's midterms or papers or anything else. And so just to review our 3 points for today, we are created in God's image to be filled with God. And only when we are filled with God can we have dominion over the creep, Satan, and over all the negative things that come up in our situation. And that we can exercise dominion not alone, but with others who are filled with God. And so I hope that you can take these 3 points with you for the rest of your Christian life, and certainly through the rest of this difficult and challenging quarter. And just remember that our purpose, is not to just get high marks, is not to just land that perfect job or whatever, but it's to be filled with God and to express him and to be the light to all of those around us.